So let's continue our exploration of what teachings in Buddhism are the foundation for our practice of forgiveness. So the first one again was the role of karma and interdependence, that things aren't happening in isolation, that everything is a product of our own actions. Of course, the ramifications of this are that then we also need to pay attention to our actions in response to what's going on, that there's that responsibility, that accountability that comes with it. The second teaching that informs the practice of forgiveness is the idea of the faults of anger and hatred. I don't know that I need to say a lot about this. I think that we're all aware of these are not states of mind that we tend to enjoy. People who enjoy these states of mind, I think, are probably a bit deluded in terms of what they really, if they think that being angry is somehow useful to them, something that they want to partake of, they must have some misunderstanding of what that mind really is doing to them. We know even physically, His Holiness often speaks about how anger even causes health problems, and people die in the midst of anger because of their inability to control things. So, sure.
I wonder, I couldn't help but reflecting on, like in the Bible, when Jesus goes into the temple
Right.
and turns over the table.
Right.
So there's something going on there. There's an energy. I can't say that, he's angry
Right.
and upset exactly, but there's some kind of energy sometimes that needs to happen.
Sure, sure.
You don't want that idiot compassion to be stepped upon.
Right, right.
So I'm really interested in.
Yeah, you bring up a really good point, Pam, because His Holiness the Dalai Lama, in a book of his teachings on that 6th chapter of Shantideva that's all about patience, the antidote to anger, in the very beginning of that, it's a book called Healing Anger. He says that in his estimation, the English word anger isn't quite the right word, because we do need to have a forceful response to injustice in the world, to things that are not quite correct, to using some, look at even when people are raising children, they use this idea of tough love. Well, tough love is a good part of raising a child, because if you don't teach them to be responsible and take accountability for their actions in whatever ways you can, they don't ever do that, They don't grow as individuals unless we create the opportunity for them to feel a little bit of the force against that. So we can do those sorts of things with a very different mindset. It's doing those sorts of things with the mind of anger, of like hatred and resentment and all that becomes problematic, because then it only creates the same type of energy. You get stuck into that type of energy. There's even a story in the past stories of the Buddha where he talks about being on a ship. He's a bodhisattva at that time, of being working towards enlightenment, and through his clairvoyance he finds that one of the merchants on the ship is going to kill the other merchants and take all of the wares that they've come on the ship with. And through that insight, he makes the compassionate decision to take the life of that man. Because, I always think, well, couldn't he have just tied him up? Or but for whatever reason, I guess this man was threatening enough that he needed to forcefully take that man's life to keep him from committing that action, not just because all these other merchants were going to be killed, but especially because he was going to create that type of negative action himself by taking all those lives. So I'm not saying, again, that when we have conflicts in the world, that there's no way to resolve them through a bit of more force, but rather that that force has to be with the right mindset. And the mindset is the problem. When we go over and we say, you did this to us, well, we're going to do something worse to you or equal to you. Well, that's not a mind that's about compassion and concern for the situation. It's a mind that is about getting, retaliation and getting back and what have you. So I think that's important. Let's look at the few quotes that I have here about anger and the faults of anger. It's interesting, there's a lot of quotes out there from the Buddha on the internet, and there's even one site now that one monk has dedicated himself to debunking Buddha quotes that aren't correct. It's called fakebuddhaquotes.com. And
People have too much time in their hands.
but I liked somebody, speaking about anger, somebody posted one that had a picture of the Buddha and it said, chill, homie, you need to let that shit go. Which we know isn't a quote from the Buddha. But it's a nice one nonetheless. This quote, actually, I put a question mark behind it because it does seem that from the research this guy has done, that this is actually, it is a Buddhist quote. It's from a writer known as Buddhaghosa, who was actually a 5th century Indian Buddhist practitioner. And it's derived from what he said. And it's a nice concept, that holding on to anger is like grasping a hot coal with the intent of throwing it at someone else. Well, who's being burned while you're holding on to that hot coal? It's interesting, Buddhaghosa's quote also includes excrement. Like if you're going to be throwing excrement at somebody, well, who's getting it all over themselves by doing that? The idea behind that quote is that you yourself are the main person who's harmed by that anger. Yes, that is going to eventually erupt into actions towards others, and they will be harmed as well. But why we don't want to be angry is because it's not good for us to be angry. And it's perfectly fine to start with that. As I said, everything starts with self-compassion, with wanting to stop creating the causes for our own suffering. You know, the mind of anger doesn't lead to anything but negative consequences for ourselves and eventually for others if we act on that anger. The other quote I threw out there from Augustine of Hippo, resentment is like taking poison and hoping the other person dies. That's a nice way of looking at it too. It's like you're the one taking the poison and your intention was to cause harm to others, but you're really the main recipient of that poison. Sure, others are harmed as well. We're not denying that our acts of anger do have repercussions. But we are the ones who initially have the detriment of that anger. And consequently, we're the ones that need to then control that anger because we will benefit from that. We will have, as I mentioned last night, more happiness if we're avoiding those negative states of mind. We've got one more little quote from Master Shantideva, that same chapter, chapter 6. It says, hence the enemy, anger, creates suffering such as these. But whoever assiduously overcomes it finds happiness now and hereafter. You know, it takes a lot to practice the diminishment of our anger and the cultivation of patience. That's why Master Shantideva wrote a whole chapter on it. That's why there's a lot of focus on this practice in particular. But our patience and tolerance is a key part of our forgiveness as well, because if we have that mind that understands that there's no real benefit to pursuing that resentment, that anger, especially again in regard to the harm we received from others, well then that's the impetus for allowing the space for forgiveness and certainly for not retaliating. And as Julie pointed out, at some point, if we've diminished this mind completely, there's not even much ground for forgiveness because we're never really even harmed. Now, it's not that we want to have other people be harmful for us so we can practice our patience. We don't want to encourage that sort of thing, but we've got that in our lives already. Master Shantideva has a wonderful way of talking about patience in another chapter, in the 5th chapter, when he's kind of introducing the idea of patience before he goes into a more specific training. He says that you could be really irritated at all the sharp objects there are in the world, all the various rocks and you know, things that would cut your feet if you were to walk on them, right? You know, and where we live in New Mexico, there's lots of that sort of stuff that you wouldn't want to go out barefoot in the desert, right? So you could think it's a really good thing to cover the whole world with leather so that it would all be flat and smooth and comfortable, right? But where would we find the amount of leather to do that? Isn't it easier to put leather underneath your own feet? And this is the principle of patience, is that you're never going to get rid of all the sharp objects in the world. You're never going to get rid of all the harm in the world. But if you cover yourself with the shoes of patience, if you actually don't allow yourself to be harmed by those things and upset by those things, you can walk wherever you want. You know, again, pretty powerful teachings. You know, and Christ taught these teachings too. You know, many great masters taught these same things. That, you know, we need to take responsibility for our emotions and how we are in the world. The third teaching, and then we'll see if there's some questions on this. I'll try to wrap up this this section on why we forgive in the Buddhist context, is the need for compassion. Here's a quote from Master Shantideva as well. If, when under the influence of disturbing conceptions, people will even kill their treasured selves, how can they be expected not to cause harm to the bodies of other living beings? I mean, what he's saying here is because we see that the delusions, the afflictions are so rampant in the minds of beings, we shouldn't be kind of surprised when it manifests in behavior that's directed towards us. I mean, we're not letting people off the hook in this way. Don't take it that way. What we're saying is we have an understanding why they do it. Sometimes in the Buddhist teachings, they compare this to the fact that if your own dear mother, and I'm assuming many of you had dear mothers, maybe you didn't have mothers who were so dear, that does happen. But if someone who was very close to you was under the influence of some sort of medication that made them crazy, made them not act like what you would ideally want to see them act, you would have some understanding around that, right? You wouldn't be like blaming them and, thinking that they're horrible people because they're acting that way. You would understand that there is a factor that is causing that confusion, causing that behavior. Well, the Buddha says we all have those factors. Those factors are called the delusions. He goes through an extensive thing in the 6th chapter of talking about how if you are hit by somebody with a stick, why don't you get angry at the stick? Because you're doing the same thing in a sense when you're getting angry at the person, because they're under the control of their delusions in the same way that the stick is under the control of the person. So what are we really upset about or angry about or wanting to be rid of are the afflictions. It's not the person. We have to hold the person in compassion because we understand that, like us, they're under the control of these mental patterns that they have been engaging in since beginningless time, that they have been strengthening. They don't even have the tools and the knowledge to be able to work with it. So it's a different way of looking at others. Once more, it doesn't mean we condone everything they do and allow them to continue to create havoc in the world. We find more skillful ways of confronting it that are rooted in that understanding and that compassion, that aren't rooted in they're horrible people, they're inherently evil people. Nobody's inherently evil. We're all that glass of water I mentioned last night, all that clarity, that purity, that just happens to have that contamination in it, happens to have that dirt, the dirt of the afflictions. All that dirt can be removed, but we need skillful tools to do that. And again, all spiritual leaders in this world system have tried to give us tools to work with that, tried to give us ways to confront our own demons and remove all of that. Why? Because we ourselves will benefit from it, and others will benefit from it because we will be more compassionate and understanding. So these are the 3 principles I see operative. That idea of karma, interdependence, that this isn't coming about from nowhere. The idea of our anger being faulty and there's no real benefit in carrying it on. Again, when we talk about anger being that delusion, that really hateful, spiteful mind, resentful mind. And there's also a great benefit to compassion. I can't help but think that if we had responded to 9/11 in a very different way and actually made some effort, sure, there's a lot of craziness, crazy thinking that needs to be overcome. I'm not denying that. But if we're not making even the effort to try to meet people in some way where we can begin to confront that and deal with that, it's just a missed opportunity. Anyway, these are my thoughts. You can agree with them, disagree with them, what have you. So let's do one more little quote. This is from His Holiness that has to do with this idea of compassion and maybe a summary to what we're looking at here. When we think of a person who creates a lot of suffering in our own land, usually frustrations, anger, hatred come. So here it's very useful to make a distinction between the action and the actor. Although we totally oppose their action, their activities, we always can keep compassion, to not develop hatred toward the person, and on that basis to develop forgiveness. Does it make sense? Hard to follow, right? Yeah. Yeah, we're challenged by a lot of folks in our world, in this country and beyond, and we have to find a way. I mean, again, it's the same sort of thing. If we are able to see that whoever it is that's that object, we each can fill in the blank, that we can see that they're a being that is suffering from a lot of delusion, a lot of wrong thinking, a lot of greed, a lot of self-concern, a lot of whatever. I mean, fill in the blank with those two. We can see the myriad numbers of deluded states of mind going on. That should only be more impetus for us to have compassion for that person and forgiveness.
This is crazy, but I do have this feeling of compassion for him.
Yeah.
Because I see him as almost like a sacrificial It's
Yeah,
almost
yeah.
like an archetypal situation that's been
True.
set up in our culture.
Right.
And he's, I mean,
A straw
that
man
was
in a
the
sense, yeah.
karma, is to be there. But now, that said, I do have to, I can't, I'm starting to react in ways I don't like. So I just
Sure.
don't listen.
Me too.
Because I feel the anger coming,
Right.
and I've just got to get over that. But
Yeah.
I really did, from the beginning, for some reason, I saw the bigger picture.
Yeah.
Now it's getting a little scary though, so.
It is. It is. Yeah. I mean, that's where, yeah, we all have to find our own balance of what we let in and what we keep out, to some degree. And that's the first measure in terms of dealing with our delusions frequently, is because we recognize there are triggers and we may not be capable of working with particular triggers. So it's okay to say, I won't listen to more verbiage because I know that I'm just going to get more volatile myself. And work with what you can, and then eventually we will have the strength of mind to be able to work with anything, Yeah, Julie.
But what about that forceful energy that we need to
Yeah.
use when there's, some
Yeah.
grave injustice happening?
Yeah. I mean,
That's a really tough question at this point.
Yeah.
in time for us.
It's a hard thing to really manage too, because that energy, if you will, that does, as His Holiness says, needs to be there to address injustice and wrong thinking in our world that is really not beneficial and helpful.
We can do it with compassion.
I think it can be. I mean, it really, and it has to be really at some level.
Oh, the
Yeah.
Dalai Lama, every minute I
Yeah.
thought you were talking about that. But again, it's that tough love thing too, with
Yeah.
that use of that energy. I mean, in other words, you don't want to respond in a way that
Yeah.
the same energy you're giving
Exactly.
back, the same energy
Exactly.
is only exacerbated.
Right.
Yes.
I mean, if you look at the atrocities that are happening in this country with the police force and Black Lives and that, I mean, it really is something that needs to be confronted. We can't just sit there and say it's perfectly fine that this continue. And yet, if you get angry and violent and everything, it just flies in the face of what it is that you're really trying to achieve, which is a peaceful culture where people can go about their business and not be confronted with that reality every day when their skin is a different color. And this is...
Can't ignore it either. So
Exactly.
do that.
Well, and I've been seeing a lot of people on the internet posting, that white silence is complicit in this, and well, you could say white silence in any other, culture that isn't siding with the African American population that is greatly affected by this reality. And, so it is something we need to respond to. But once more, do we do that with anger? Do we do that with, frustration and annoyance and all of this hatred? Or do we do it with, we need to find peaceful solutions to all of this. We need to work through that in some way. It's not easy. We've got things that are kind of in our culture that go back centuries that, need to be addressed, But to put our heads in the sand and to think that somehow this isn't a problem in our country is ridiculous when the reality is it is. So let me do one more little quote and then we'll be kind of moving into the 3 levels of forgiveness. I do want to try to get to at least the first level and do a short meditation on that before we conclude the morning. This is a final quote from Venerable Thich Nhat Hanh, who many of you are aware of, great Vietnamese Buddhist practitioner. Forgiveness will not be possible until compassion is born in your heart. Even if you want to forgive, you cannot forgive. So I think at some level we do see that compassion and forgiveness are very much intertwined. And so it's important to at least have an understanding that this is the real seed of our forgiveness, is having a compassionate response to the suffering of the world and the suffering of the beings who are creating difficulties for ourselves and others in the world. Any final questions or comments about what we've looked at in that? Yeah, Vanessa.
I totally agree with the whole forgiveness, not even in your anger.
Mm-hmm.
But my recent incident is at work. I'm in
Uh-huh.
an office with about 6 to 8 hours a day with the same people, and it just got in a situation where it was just volatile and just, especially two people were just arguing and angry and this race that and race this, and how do you, and it's just that negative energy. It's like I couldn't help but absorb that, and it was driving me crazy, and that's one of the reasons why I kind of quit that job. But when you're in a situation where it's like 6 to 8 hours with the same group of people in this
Right.
confined space, how do you react with compassion? I mean, I could,
Sure. Again, I think to be able to practice compassion in those situations means that we have to do some practice to support that. It's not something that we're going to have instantly just on the thought, oh, I need to be compassionate. I mean, if that was all it took, was the thought, I need to be compassionate, we'd all be compassionate almost instantly. So this is just like any of these things in Buddhism, which means that we have to practice. We have to train our minds to have that kind of response and to frame things in that way. So just like I was talking about how, if you see that person who is engaging in that type of behavior and being really difficult and causing more volatility in the workplace, if you can frame them in the light through your own meditation and practice and understanding to see them as a being who's suffering from some deluded thinking in the way that they're interacting with others, then you at least have the space to react, if you need to react, in ways that aren't going to be driven by the same type of energy that they're exhibiting, because you're reframing it in a different way. You're looking at it through the lens of, this is a being I need to have concern for, compassion for, and maybe you can't help them at the moment.
Yeah, but I
You know.
tried to, like I
Yeah.
tried to bring up the word compassion, and their response was like, "You're so naive, and people will manipulate you." I mean, that was their kind of response, but
Yeah.
it's just,
Yeah,
I know, like, people like that are
sure.
always gonna face that, interprofessional.
And this is the reality, is we don't necessarily always have the ability, and I would say most of the time we don't have the ability to help others to the extent that we would like to, because we do see that from our own experience there's some benefit to having these states of mind, to being able to address the delusions and to having a calmer, more peaceful mind. But just having that perspective, again, isn't enough to be able to truly help that person. We need a lot more wisdom to be able to know how to do that. So frequently the work is, I can help to some extent by not contributing to it. I'm not going to fan the flames of all of this stuff. I'm not going to participate. And I'm going to hold a space for my own compassionate response to it. But maybe I can't do anything to change that person in the moment. And maybe it means that if it becomes where the situation is too volatile, we need to remove ourselves from it, because we're not going to contribute to it in any way in terms of solving it. And that's perfectly fine. I think that's part of our practice too, is to know when we've reached our limitations. Otherwise it does become a bit of idiot compassion, as Chogyam Trungpa called it, where we just intervene with just all these good intentions, but we have no idea what we're doing. It's kind of like Venerable Ramina uses the example of, if you went to Nepal, and in some parts of Nepal they don't have any kind of eye protection, and because of the elevations, they're dealing with pretty intense sunlight, and they end up with a lot of eye problems, cataracts and what have you, very young ages, because of the influence of the sun. Well, you can have a lot of compassion from seeing that, and then you go, well, let me fix that for you. And of course, you get out a scalpel or whatever you want to do. Now they do it with lasers and all this, but if you were actually going to do something to them and you didn't have the skill, the knowledge, they'd say, thank you very much, but leave my eyes alone. I'll deal with my suffering. And it's the same thing if we don't have the ability to help, if we haven't actually generated the wisdom component, the compassion. They often talk about these being the two wings of a bird we need. The compassion is great. It's a wonderful energy behind what we're doing, because that concern for the suffering of the world and our response to it is essential. But if we don't have the wisdom to know what to do with that, it is a bit blind. It is a bit of idiot compassion. Now, how do you get that wisdom? That's also through your practice. That's also through developing our minds and our insight and our ability to have some ability to convey what needs to be heard at that moment, what might get through to people at that moment. We may not even have that ability for some people until we're completely enlightened. That's what Lama Yeshe says is one of the driving forces behind our wish to become fully enlightened. Jennifer, who was here last night, was talking about this idea of urgency. Well, where does that urgency to do this type of work come from? It can frequently come from the fact that we recognize there's so much suffering in the world, and we just aren't at a place yet where we can do anything about it. So I want to get to a place where I could do something about it, because until then, that suffering is going to keep happening. So there are situations where we simply need to put up our hands and say, sorry, I just can't do anything about the situation. I don't have the ability. I don't have the skill. I don't know what to do. I can work on myself, maintain my own composure, not fan the flames, but I can't do anything beyond that. So that's okay. Now, again, we could probably spend hours looking at various things with that scenario and see, well, have you explored this and have you explored that? Those sorts of things are good to be aware of, that, frequently we can interject in some way, and you did try by talking about compassion and got a different response than what you were hoping for. Those sorts of things can be tried, but at some point it may just come to the reality that we aren't capable at that moment. That shouldn't be discouraging for us. It should be encouraging for us to keep doing the work to get more capable, to have better skills, to be more powerful in a sense in that situation. So I don't know if that helps, but gives maybe some context to understand that. So let's go on then and begin our discussion of these three types, the three levels. So the very first one, generating forgiveness for yourself, I want to first explore the idea of what is self-forgiveness. Because I think this could be a little confusing for us sometimes, because we're the recipients of this as well as the givers of it, right? So it's kind of looks a little bit like, a snake eating its own tail or something. Like, where does the one end and the other begin? This is how Rick Hansen, he's written a book called The Buddha's Mind, doctor who has given us this little insight from his perspective about what we mean about self-forgiveness. Seeing faults clearly, taking responsibility for them with remorse and making amends, and then coming to peace about them. This is what he means by self-forgiveness. Again, this is something that is one way of talking about it. It's not absolute, but there's some components in this that I think are quite nice and are involved in what we're going to be doing in this practice. Seeing faults clearly means that we can't hide our heads in the sand in regard to what we've done. I was talking over the break with Julie about forgiveness in my own life, and I'd say probably most of my forgiveness I practice has been self-forgiveness. I don't know that I've had as many people inflicting things on me as much as I've needed to look at myself and give myself the space for that type of healing. And when we use this word remorse, taking responsibility for them with remorse, another word that we use in Tibetan Buddhism frequently is the idea of regret. Regret can have positive and negative tones as well, though. What we mean by this sense of remorse or regret is simply the feeling of acknowledging that it wasn't the best thing for us to have done, that there was some unskillfulness to that, and we regret having done that. It doesn't mean, once more, that we throw all this kind of guilt on it. I've mentioned this the other night, but in Tibetan Buddhism, there isn't even the word guilt. This word does not exist. You cannot find that word. This is a Western creation to a large degree, at least, we're deriving from Judeo-Christian traditions, I think, and all of that, maybe even culturally around various things in our culture. This sense of guilt is not what we mean by this. It means that we are simply acknowledging, I did that, and I wish I hadn't done that. I wish I had better knowledge and better ability to avoid doing that. But I did do it, taking responsibility. The last part, making amends. Making amends here means with ourselves, with kind of being okay at some level, with coming to a place of healing, coming to a place of peace, as he says, about them. So this is what we're going to be exploring in regard to this. There's some need to maybe look at why we need to do this. I already have talked about it a little bit, but we'll just review that in terms of this next slide. This is from Jack Kornfield. He says, finding a way to extend forgiveness to ourselves is one of our most essential tasks. Just as others have been caught in suffering, so have we. If we look honestly at our life, we can see the sorrows and pain that have led to our own wrongdoing. In this, we can finally extend forgiveness to ourselves. We can hold the pain we have caused in compassion. Without such mercy, we will never live our own, or we will live our own life in exile. We'll kind of exile ourselves from our true connection to ourselves as well as to others. So this is an important part of it, is to really be able to look honestly at what we have done and hold ourselves in the sphere of compassion. Because we too are works in progress, as I said in the motivation today, that we are continually trying to strive to be better, to move along this path, and we do have faults, we do make mistakes. We are not our faults and mistakes. We are simply beings, this clear container in which all of this is trying to be addressed and removed, and some of it is tougher stuff than others. So we just have to have that willingness to keep doing the work to confront and forgive ourselves for the failings that we have committed and certainly trying to make that commitment to move forward in more positive ways. By the way, I think we're getting into the territory where some of these are on your sheet. So on that one sheet that you have the notes on the forgiveness meditation, that quote from Jack Kornfield is there, as well as the one from Rick Hansen. So now we go to the actual process of doing that. How do we forgive ourselves? How do you actually do that? And so we're going to look on the sheet, as well as I will have the same slides up there. When you look at the other one, the forgiveness meditation by Jack Kornfield, you'll see that actually what's there is very brief. And that's why I put together these notes, is because I do think it does benefit from having some additional thoughts that we can look at and entertain before we actually engage in the practice. So when I lead you in that today, we'll be doing some of that. And we're not going to work with forgiving ourselves for everything we've ever done. We won't do that today. But we'll begin with just forgiving ourselves for something that we've done that maybe isn't even that big, but something that we can begin to work with, begin to soften around. So the very first of the steps is to reflect on how you have not forgiven yourself fully for any of the three types of actions you have done that have harmed yourself and which have also often been harmful to others. And this is, again, the reality that we don't live in a bubble. Sometimes we have done things that have really just been about harming ourselves, ways that we've held ourselves back, made ourselves miserable. But those, even in some degree, do affect the people around us as well. So there are three doors, they frequently call them, through which our karma is created, through which various energies are created, if you will. And those are the ways that we need to address this idea of self-forgiveness. And we're going to look at these in regard to all the other types of forgiveness that we engage in. Those are our physical actions, the things that we've actually done with our bodies. We've got speech, our way of verbally communicating with others. And then we have just our thoughts. And you might think, again, thoughts may not hurt anybody, but the reality is our thoughts are where it all starts. We don't do things with our speech and our bodies without our minds being involved as well. So this is kind of a little bit of a contemplation. And again, when we do this, we'll just go through one. We're not going to work with the whole trunk load of things if you feel you have them, or basket full of things, whatever extent you feel that you've got things you need to work on. We'll just work with one. And it's good to do that, to just start with one. And as I was saying, begin self-forgiveness with less significant things and work up to those that are heavier. This is at least the advice that's generally given. Now, there may be something that you really feel you need to tackle because it's such a huge thing in your life, and you need to kind of do that work because you feel it's a real obstacle to moving on. You have permission to do that. I'm not telling you how to do this practice exactly. I'm just giving you some general guidelines. So if you find that there is something really holding you back, that you really need to forgive yourself for, that is huge in your life, start there, because that may be real benefit to you. And you may find some of the smaller things quite easy to work with after doing that deeper work. So this is a general guideline, not an absolute. And then as you do this practice, I think this is an important part of it, and I'll try to interject some ways of reminding you of that as we go through the meditation, is to, oh, it went blank. I don't know, why did it do that?
No signal? No signal.
I don't know why there would be no signal unless,
Maybe it just slipped up.
I mean, the computer screen is black over here, but I don't know why it went black unless her battery. Okay, well, we have the sheet in front of us. Let's go continue. We'll deal with the computer over the break. So we have in front of us this, as you do this practice, appreciate your good qualities. This is the third little bullet point under how do I forgive myself. Appreciate your good qualities, especially your willingness to work with your own faults in this way. Once more, I mentioned this last night in response to Lauren's question about, how do we keep our perseverance in that. We need to take delight in what we've done and continually be our own best friend, encourage us by acknowledging the ways that we are moving forward, that we are making improvements, that we are beginning to address the dirt in the water, that we're making some effort there. And that will lead to further effort. That will lead to kind of feeding that whole willingness to look at this stuff, to get our hands messy, to look at the dirt. Then the next bullet point, acknowledge what you have already done in this life to learn and grow from those experiences. This is another key part of it, is that usually those experiences, because they are something that we feel is still there, that needs to be addressed, we probably have learned something from that, from having to revisit it frequently, to having to look at it. Give yourself some credit for that. That's wonderful that you've already maybe you had an interaction with somebody that you go, my God, I will never talk to that person again, but you still feel really bad that you did that. Well, work with it in this context, but give yourself some credit for the fact that you kept your mouth shut the next time. You didn't say those things. You were kinder. This is the type of behavior we want to encourage in ourselves, and we do that by taking note of it, appreciating it, acknowledging it. The next bullet point, observe whatever feeling of forgiveness that arises in your heart, as well as thoughts in your mind, sensations in your body. This actually comes from Gina Sharp. I mentioned her a few times on the sheet. She's a Theravadan teacher, Insight Meditation Society teacher, and she did a series on forgiveness that I listened to, and it was very nice. I liked her way of approaching it. She worked with the same meditation, and I'm using a few of the ideas that she had in the instruction she gave people to work with this. But she had this idea of really not just making it a mental practice, really look at what else is happening for you. We talk about heart and mind as if they're two different things. They're maybe just kind of two different ways of looking at the same phenomenon, which is some aspect of our awareness or consciousness. But our heart space feels a little different than just our mental space. And so see what happens in terms of some shift or change in your heart. If it happens, don't beat yourself up if it doesn't happen. Don't think that there's doing something wrong if it doesn't happen. Some things may shift our heart, make us feel a little more open from this work. We also can look at even sensations in the body. We are embodied beings. We're not our bodies. Our bodies are, in a sense, a receptacle for the consciousness, but even the consciousness isn't us in the end in a real concrete way. But we do have this physical body that is interrelated with our mind and our mental states. And sometimes we can feel physical changes from the work we do mentally and spiritually and emotionally and in our hearts. So just take note of those. Again, doesn't mean good, bad, whatever. It just means something's happening, something's shifting. Pay attention to it because you might benefit from that. The next point, second to last one, engage in the practice as best as you can. This is the advice I give constantly for every one of these. Even if it doesn't feel genuine at first, it will become more authentic over time. This is the fake it till you make it kind of advice that we're constantly giving in Buddhism, because you can sit there and, I'm going to meditate on compassion, and like nothing's happening, and you just keep bringing the thoughts of suffering, and the heart's just staying all enclosed and tight. It's okay. Just keep doing it till something shifts, till something changes. Same with the forgiveness meditation then. And then finally, conclude the meditation by reflecting on your own values and aspirations that you want to honor and uphold in the future, and establish a strong intention to continue in that direction. So again, this is an important part of it too, because it's like taking the experience, whatever that was like, whatever level of intensity or lack of intensity there was, and funneling it into action, funneling it into, and this is how I want to go forward. These are the values I want to uphold. This is the way I want to be in the world. Because here you are looking at the ways that you haven't been, up to par, up to where you'd like to ideally be. So it's good to get in touch with that at the end, to reaffirm what standards and ideals you're holding in your life currently that you would like to continue to uphold. All right? Questions on any of this? I realize I've gone through it a little bit quickly, but I do want to kind of taste the chocolate a bit, as Lama Yeshe used to say, Do something that gets us into the actual experience of it. Enough blah, 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 as he says. Lama Zopa says this a lot too. Any questions, comments? Okay. Well, let's do a little meditation. You might stand up, because we've been sitting already again for a little bit. Stand up, stretch out a little bit, get the blood flowing before you sit down and do meditation. It's just useful to do that. Otherwise, we just go right from having been sitting into more sitting, and it can be a little complicated. So again, just a little bit of a stretch. Okay. So let's go ahead and begin then. Again, we don't meditate with the body, but the body, as I was saying, is kind of in the interdependence with the mind. So it is good to pay some attention to your physical posture before you begin. You know, various elements of posture kind of support our meditation, whereas other ways of holding the body get in the way of meditation. So as I mentioned this morning, the most important component of our physical posture is having an upright back. It's not like you straighten the spine more than it is. You just find that place where the spine is naturally upright. You might need to even move around on kind of this fulcrum, this center point of your body, and find the place where there's the least resistance, where it's kind of like the body is naturally upright. You don't need to tighten the lower back or tighten the abdomen. You're just simply resting upright, kind of like the way a tree just is naturally rooted and naturally upright, and also feeling quite resilient, just like a tree. So when the winds of whatever, come into the mind, into the body, we're just simply allowing the body to be, allowing the body to rest in this upright posture. I'll mention a few other components of posture. If you're sitting on the floor, then just have the legs comfortably, and if you need to move your legs, that's perfectly fine. If you're sitting in a chair, it is good to have the feet flat on the ground in front of you. This creates a nice kind of solid posture. You can place the hands in the lap if you wish. The traditional posture is the hands upright, palms up, and the thumbs together, the right on top of the left. You can place them on the knees with the palms down, the palms up, or wherever they're comfortable for you. And once more, if you need to move them, that's fine as well. You might pay attention also to the head and some various aspects around the head. The head should be upright on top of the spine. It can be tilted forward very slightly, tucking the chin in just a bit if you wish. Bringing the gaze downward. If you can, keep the eyelids very slightly open. This is said to be ideal. But if you need to close the eyes, if that's more comfortable for you, you're welcome to do that. But if you have the eyes slightly open, bring the gaze downward with kind of just a sort of open gaze. You're not staring at anything in particular, not looking at any particular point, just having a sort of soft focus to the eyes. So those are some of the main elements of posture, but as I said earlier as well, try to relax into this posture. If you see some tension in the neck and shoulders or any other parts of the body, just soften into those. So as we did before, we're going to just start with just 2 minutes or so of watching the breath. Give ourselves an opportunity to reconnect with some sense of focus, concentration, by tuning into the breath. Again, either through that point at the tip of the nose, or in whatever way you work with the breath. So again, I'll ring the bowl to start our meditation, and then after a few minutes of this silent meditation on the breath, I'll lead you in the forgiveness meditation where we're working with forgiving ourselves. So now I want to invite you to leave behind the breath. Just continue breathing normally. But stop paying attention to the breath and instead begin by examining what sorts of unresolved things you have in regard to your own past actions, things that perhaps you haven't forgiven yourself fully for yet. And I want you simply to choose one. Again, it can be an action we did physically towards another being, or maybe even just with ourselves, an action we've done verbally, an action that we've done solely with our thoughts. But choose one that you feel that you'd like to work with, that you feel is safe for you, if that's a concern, or if you are being adventurous, that you have that desire to really begin to confront that. But just be very clear of what you're working with and having some level of comfort to begin to examine that particular thing that requires some self-forgiveness. So you can think that there are many ways through your past actions that you've hurt or harmed yourself, and now you're going to work with that particular action that you brought to mind. Think that in this way, through that action that you did, you have, in a sense, betrayed or abandoned yourself, whether it was by thought, by word, by deed. And you may have done that quite knowingly, or you may have done it unknowingly. So simply allow yourself to feel that action that you did that you're working with, to acknowledge it, to bring it into the forefront of your mind and see it through that lens. This is something that you did engage in, that you take responsibility for, whether you knew you were doing it or were obscured to your doing it. Try to picture that situation, remember that situation. If you can, even feel the sorrow that arose from that situation, for yourself in particular. Acknowledge as well the sorrow or heaviness from having carried this, and sense that you can now release this burden. Ever since having done that action, you've carried that burden. But now you have the opportunity to let that go, to forgive yourself. So now, in extending this forgiveness to yourself, want to encourage you to find the words that work for you. I'll say some that Jack Kornfield advises, but find what works for you. What words do you hear the most that extend this forgiveness to yourself? For the ways I have hurt myself through this action or inaction, out of my own fear, my pain, my confusion, I now extend a full and heartfelt forgiveness. I forgive myself. I forgive myself. You can use words along those lines, whatever works for you. Try to hold yourself in regard to that action in the space of extending forgiveness, the space for healing, the space for letting go of that burden. Another way to do this, if you're finding this difficult, is to work with the breath, a form of tonglen or taking and giving. Breathe in that forgiveness. Feel it permeate your whole being. And breathe out any of that heaviness, that burden. Feel yourself become lighter. Feel yourself be forgiven. Breathing in the forgiveness, breathing out the heaviness, the burden, letting go. As you continue doing this, observe whatever level of forgiveness manifests in terms of your heart, the thoughts that arise in your mind, any sensations in the body. And just continue to do this. I forgive myself, breathing in that forgiveness. And then letting go of the burden, having carried that for so long, the heaviness of that. Breathing that out. And also acknowledge the strides that you've made forward from having done that action, the ways that you've changed positively, the things you've done differently perhaps, or even just the impetus, the idea that you'd like to do better. Rejoice in this. Take delight in that. That we're works in progress that are continually striving to do better, nonetheless making mistakes. Can hold the forgiveness in that sphere. Seeing how even our faults, our mistakes give us opportunities to improve, to develop different qualities, better qualities. I forgive myself. And then before we conclude, to first of all think that looking back over these few minutes of working with self-forgiveness, just acknowledge, however authentic or real it felt, that it's just practice, just training your mind. Be very gentle with yourself in that. Recognize that the results may not be immediate. It may not even feel like it's working per se. But we're simply planting seeds. We're simply trying to create the causes, the conditions for that healing to happen. And once more, take delight in that. Your willingness to do this work, regardless of how effective it might have felt. And then finally, to remind ourselves of the values, the ideals that we want to live our lives by, some of which may be in contrast then to this action that we've just worked with, that we've tried to forgive ourselves for. How is it that you want to be in the world? What are the actions of body, speech, and mind that you want to cultivate, that you hold to be valuable and dear, that you think are an essential part of who you want to be, the changes you want to see in your own life, in your own mind? And just renew the conviction to abide by those, to try to live that, to make that path a part of your being. Okay. So any reflections on that or questions on the meditation? Did anyone find it difficult to find something? It does happen sometimes. Yeah,
I found
okay.
it difficult. Finding
Find
something
it.
was easy.
Oh, finding something was easy.
Yeah.
Finding the meditation difficult.
I was,
Okay.
I was squirming a lot.
Squirming a lot.
Yeah.
Okay.
I find it really difficult to sit still.
Yeah.
It lives in me physically a bit, in the regret.
Sure.
Certain things. And then I would get really still for a little bit.
Uh-huh.
And start squirming again when you kept talking. Yeah.
Okay, good. So one of the challenges, I mentioned this the other night with the smaller group at, we were talking about our Discovering Buddhism program, the first module, is that it's very hard with guided meditation to get everyone to the same place in a sense, you know.
Speak out a little louder.
Oh, I'm sorry, Julie. Were you able to hear me during the meditation though? Mostly, okay, I'll need to remind myself to project a bit more during that, because that's what happens when we get into a meditative space. I stop projecting to some degree. So, but one of the challenges that we face with guided meditation, like what we just did, is that I can't be assured that you're all going to get to the same place in a sense, or have a similar experience even though you're all hearing the same words. And this is just a challenge of that, and so give some space around that too, to understand that today is really just to introduce you to these practices. The real work starts when you're able to sit in your own space with your mind and work with it in the way that works for you. And for some of you, it may be that you get into something and you're finding it so difficult that it feels like you need to pull back and pull out of it and maybe do something else. And then you go back to it again, and each time you go back, it becomes a little more permeable. You get through a little bit more stuff. And that's perfectly fine. You know, this is simply just to give you the tool of the meditation and learn the components of it, what works, you know, and then do the work on your own to some degree. So I'm glad you brought that up, because it gave me the opportunity to speak to that, because I think it can be challenging to do this type of work in the period of time here, and especially if it is something that does require a little bit more attention. Did you feel like there was some clues that you have on the basis of what you experienced as to what you need to do when you leave here then, in terms of? Okay, good.
Yeah, I found it really powerful.
Okay.
I felt it, I felt really, when I thought about these things in the past, it makes me anxious to
Sure.
think about them, because I don't,
Yeah.
but then I was able to find a bit of peace around them.
Mhm.
Moments, you know, I sort of started to see some glimpses of light there and here.
Yeah, good.
In the tunnel, so it was very powerful, yeah.
Okay, good.
Yeah.
Good. Thank you for sharing that, Guy. Yeah, Pam, were you
Yeah,
going to say a bit more?
So I'm just curious, you know, I was working on this particular thing in my life that I
Mm-hmm.
regret.
Sure.
You know, it has to do with my children and blah, 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 blah. But I find that I'll get sleepy about
Sure.
it, and I wonder how much of that is just kind of escaping from actually being
Sure.
there, right? So I do keep bringing myself back, but I notice that sleepiness, when I really start to become present with this thing that's pretty
Mhm.
big, I start getting sleepy again. So maybe I'm just tired. I don't know, but I have a feeling it's more than just being tired.
Yeah,
You
maybe,
know?
maybe.
I don't know.
I can't say for sure either, but I do think that our minds are pretty devilish when it comes to it. You know, they do figure out ways sometimes to avoid doing the work. Maybe that's like, I don't want to say minds necessarily, maybe it's just more of our ego or some component of us that just is a bit resistant, and so it might be throwing things out there. That might be the sleepiness, or some people might find it be distractedness, things that come in that it tantalize you and cause you to move off of it. But yeah, we do have a certain level of that in our minds that we have to conquer in doing any type of meditation. I always talk about, and mentioned the other night, that we have kind of two forces. One that sort of, the way I visualize it is it sort of draws you out of the space, kind of causes you to go to other places, to other ideas, and then you have the other one that kind of collapses in on itself, that it's almost like once we finally stop and start looking at the mind in a quieter space, it just starts going in on itself and becomes sometimes sleep, sometimes just a real dullness to the mind. So we're constantly dealing with those two forces in our meditation, and they may just be, like you said, a product of physical tiredness or even mental fatigue that can be there that is around the issue. But it's good to have some awareness then of how to keep moving through that. And sometimes it might mean changing things physically, maybe sitting up a little bit taller perhaps, and then opening the eyes maybe even so that we stay a little bit more awake and engaged and don't avert to, the sleepiness. But it's just really, again, something we each have to navigate and work with. So it's hard to say, is it some kind of subconscious block to getting there, or is it just a product of where we're at physically right now? Hard to say. But it's interesting. What I would encourage you to do is keep doing, if you haven't been doing this self-forgiveness meditation, keep doing it with that issue and see if it becomes, symptomatic of every time you go there, this is what happens. Well, then you might need to look at that and see you've got some obstacle to getting to that, and maybe try to figure out ways to penetrate into that are gentle, not, crashing through it, but helping you to remove that. And so, yeah. This is tough work. I mean, we just get even like a little taste of it. You see that, and again, I'm not expecting that everybody had perfect experiences, perfect examples of this. For some people, it might just be a real struggle to get in touch with these kinds of things and work with. That's okay too. It's just practice. One student I had in Santa Fe, I love when she said this. She said we have this phrase in English, right? Practice makes perfect. But in her estimation, practice makes practice. And I remind myself of that all the time. I mean, the practice just leads to more practice. So practice leads to more practice. In Buddhism, we like to hold that ideal of like the perfection at the end of it that is state of Buddhahood. But, for most of us, it's just continual practice. We just keep doing the work. And that's the work. You just keep doing it. And it does change. It does improve over time. But you just keep doing it. So I think we're at time for lunch. We can take some more questions when we return, and we'll try to examine then the two other meditations that are involved in this. Maybe before we go to lunch, we're just going to do a short blessing prayer for the food that we're going to partake of. We could think about the food that's been arranged there so lovingly by Kate. She's amazing. She's doing all this work behind the scenes to make that happen. But all the beings that are behind that food. We have countless sentient beings that were involved in the production of all the various things that we'll be eating. We can think about all of them, how we are dependent upon their incredible kindness for the food that we're going to partake of. So we want to make the best use of that food, to consume that food with this strong desire to be a benefit to all beings, to use it to nourish our bodies, our minds, so we can continue doing the work that will lead to our ability to fully benefit them. We can also think about our amazing teachers, so many teachers that we depend upon to continue to have this guidance, this instruction in our lives that will help to accomplish that full awakening. Just as we eventually want to be guides to others, we have to appreciate the guides that we have. And so whoever that might be that you're thinking of, you can, maybe some of you have His Holiness the Dalai Lama as a guide that you pay attention to. Might be other guides from other traditions, historically, might not even be somebody who's alive today. But think about that guide appearing at your heart in whatever form works for you. For some people it might be as the Buddha, might be simply as that being that you're visualizing, that you're thinking of. But think that being at your heart is all the guides, all those beings that we rely upon, and we're going to make this perfect, pure offering to them. Thinking about it as perfect nectar, transcendental, blissful. And as you consume the food, think that it goes down to your heart center and becomes the perfect offering to your guides. Helps them to bestow their blessings upon you, to increase your own potential to continue this path, to make great strides. So we're going to recite a little prayer that's all about offering to our guides, to the gurus. And if you know this, you can go along, chant along with it. There begins with the recitation of three syllables in this mantra that helps to bless and transform the food. Om Ahung, Om Ahung, Om Ahung, Lama Sangye Lama Chu Deshin Lama Gedunte Kun Gije Po Lama Te Lama Namla Cho Parbo. Those words mean the Guru is Buddha, the Guru is Dharma, the Guru is Sangha also. The Guru is the creator of all happiness. To all our precious Gurus, we make this offering. Okay, so enjoy. So we're going to aim for reconvening in about an hour. Hopefully that gives us enough time for lunch.